Is that dress supposed to be vintage or just outdated? James laughed, his voice cutting through the dinner party chatter. His coworker Christine giggled, her hand lingering on his shoulder as she leaned in. Maybe she found it in her mother's closet, she added with a smirk. Everyone watched my humiliation in stunned silence. Yet 15 minutes later, my husband would be on his knees, tears streaming down his face, begging me not to walk away forever. Hey there, amazing souls. If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button right now. It's completely free, supports our channel, and ensures you never miss another story of transformation and triumph. Now, let's dive into today's journey. The crystal, glasses clinked, and expensive perfume hung in the air as I stood frozen in the center of our living room. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Colleagues from James's law firm, neighbors from our gated community, and Christine, the paralegal who'd been working late with my husband for months. I'd spent hours getting ready for this dinner party, choosing a midnight blue dress that James had once said brought out the color of my eyes. Now, that same dress was ammunition for his mockery. Honestly, Eliza, James continued, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair, you had access to my credit card. You could have at least bought something from this decade. The room filled with uncomfortable laughter, some genuine, others forced out of obligation to the host. Christine's laughter was the loudest, her designer dress and diamond earrings catching the light as she tilted her head back. Some women just don't understand how to present themselves, she stage whispered to the woman beside her. The wine in my glass trembled as I tightened my grip. 8 years of marriage had taught me to recognize the signs. James was drinking more than usual, his jokes growing sharper as the night progressed. But he'd never humiliated me so publicly before, never with such deliberate cruelty. I smiled weakly, years of social conditioning taking over. I've always liked classic styles, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. Classic? Is that what we're calling it? James snorted, his eyes finding Christine's across the room. The private joke that passed between them was unmistakable, intimate, in a way that turned my stomach. Dr. Melissa Foster, our neighbor, and one of the few genuine friends I had left, caught my eye from across the room. Her slight frown showed concern, but in a room full of James's admirers, she remained silent. I couldn't blame her. You know, said Michael, James's law partner, clearly trying to diffuse the tension, I think that color is actually coming back, this season. James waved him off. Mike, you're too kind. My wife needs honesty, not charity. He raised his glass. To honesty, however painful it might be. A few guests raised their glasses half-heartedly. Christine enthusiastically clinked hers against James. Their eyes locked in a way that everyone in the room couldn't help but notice. My cheeks burned with humiliation. Speaking of honesty, James continued, emboldened by the alcohol. Did I tell everyone about Eliza's attempt to redecorate my office? Nearly gave my clients a heart attack with those awful prints she picked out. As conversations resumed around me, I moved toward the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. Our home, the showcase Tudor revival we'd renovated together, suddenly felt like an elaborately decorated prison. The marble countertops I'd obsessed over, the custom cabinetry, the imported tiles, all of it seemed to mock me now. I placed my wineglass on the counter and gripped the edge, trying to steady myself. The woman in the reflection of our stainless steel refrigerator looked like a stranger, wide-eyed, pale, diminished somehow. When had I become this person? When had I started accepting less than I deserved? I thought back to when we'd first met at Columbia Law. I'd been on track to graduate with honors, with multiple job offers already lined up. Somehow, over the years, my career had taken a back seat to supporting James's ambitions. My legal expertise was now relegated to reviewing his contracts and occasionally helping with research, unpaid and uncredited. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. James appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from annoyance to forced concern when he noticed my posture. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, his voice lowered but still sharp. "We have guests." "What's wrong with me?" I repeated, the words barely audible. "You just humiliated me in front of everyone we know." James rolled his eyes, reaching past me for the wine bottle. "Don't be so sensitive. It was a joke." He refilled his glass, splashing red wine onto the counter I'd meticulously cleaned earlier. "Besides, that dress really doesn't do you any favors." "And what about Christine?" I asked quietly. "Does she do you favors, James?" His eyes narrowed. "You're being ridiculous. She's a colleague." "A colleague who texts you at midnight? Who has her own special ringtone on your phone?" "Jesus, Eliza, are you spying on me now?" He took a long sip of wine. "This is exactly why—" He stopped himself. "Why what?" I pressed. "Nothing. Just pull yourself together and come back out. People are going to notice." As he turned to leave, something inside me shifted. A small crack in the foundation of fear and obligation I'd built my marriage upon. The sensation was unfamiliar, almost frightening in its intensity. It wasn't just about the dress or the mockery. It was about the years of subtle undermining, the gradual erosion of my confidence, the way he'd convinced me that his success was the only success that mattered. It was about Christine, yes, but it was about so much more. I straightened my shoulders and followed him back to the living room, where our guests had broken into smaller conversation groups. Christine stood by the fireplace, her perfectly manicured nails tracing the stem of her wine glass as she held court with 3 of James's colleagues. "Did James tell you about their trip to Aspen last month?" I overheard her say. "The conference was brutal, but we managed to sneak away for some actual fun." The word "we" hung in the air, deliberate and possessive. She knew I could hear her. She wanted me to hear her. As I watched them, my husband and his not-so-secret lover, I realized I didn't recognize my life anymore. Somewhere along the way, I'd become a prop in James's performance, a convenient backdrop for the image he wanted to project. The devoted wife, the elegant hostess, the woman who had given up her own ambitions to support her husband's dreams. The revelation didn't come with tears or panic. Instead, a strange calm settled over me as I moved through our home, nodding at conversations and refilling glasses. I caught sight of our wedding photo on the mantel, James and I beaming on the steps of the courthouse, both of us clutching law books instead of flowers, an inside joke about our shared passion. That woman, in the photo, confident, ambitious, beloved. Where had she gone? And how could I find her again? The decision forming in my mind wasn't hasty or emotional. It was long overdue. I discreetly checked my watch. By midnight, this charade would be over, one way or another. This dinner party wouldn't end the way James expected. Neither would our marriage. The woman who had entered this room in a midnight blue dress might have been willing to endure humiliation for the sake of keeping peace, but she wouldn't be the same woman who walked out. Sometimes, the most powerful realization isn't that you need to leave, it's that you should have left long ago. And as I watched James refill Christine's glass, his hand lingering against hers, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment alone to process the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. The guest bathroom was my private sanctuary during these elaborate dinner parties, the one room James hadn't insisted on redesigning to impress his colleagues. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I leaned against the marble vanity, finally, letting out the breath I'd been holding. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, her makeup flawless, her hair perfectly styled, her eyes hollow. Behind that careful facade, a war was raging. "You're overreacting," whispered the voice I'd cultivated over 8 years of marriage. "It was just a joke." Everyone gets teased sometimes. But another voice, long silenced but suddenly resurgent, countered, "No one deserves public humiliation, especially from the person who promised to love and cherish them." I splashed cold water on my wrists, a trick my mother had taught me to calm down without ruining makeup. My mother, what would she think if she could see me now? She'd raised me to be strong, independent, to never let anyone diminish me. Yet here I was, a shadow of the woman I'd once been. My phone buzzed in my clutch, a text from Melissa. "Are you okay? That was brutal. I can create a diversion if you need to escape." Tears pricked at my eyes. At least someone in that room recognized what was happening. I typed back, "I'll be fine. Thank you for noticing. Thank you for—" As I stared at those words, "I'll be fine," I realized how often I'd said them. How many times I'd convinced myself that things would improve if I just tried harder, looked better, complained less. The pattern was clear now. James would push, boundaries I would accommodate, and the cycle would begin again with boundaries pushed even further. I thought back to the early days of our relationship. We'd met during a mock trial competition. Opponents who'd fallen in love over late-night debate preparations. He'd admired my sharp mind then, called me his intellectual equal. When had that changed? When had admiration transformed into contempt? Was it when he made partner while I was still an associate? Or when I took time off after my father's death? Perhaps it was more gradual. Small criticisms that grew more frequent, minor corrections that became public rebukes, subtle undermining, that escalated to tonight's humiliation. I opened my clutch and pulled out my compact mirror, examining my face more closely. There were fine lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when we'd met, not just from aging, but from years of anxiety, of walking on eggshells, of smiling through pain. From the living room, I heard increased laughter, James holding court. No doubt. He always became more animated, more charismatic when I wasn't by his side, as if my absence freed him to be his true self. The realization hit me with surprising clarity. I wasn't enhancing his life. I was constraining it. And he wasn't enhancing mine. He was diminishing it. We weren't partners. We were opponents in a match I hadn't realized I was playing. My hand trembled as I reapplied my lipstick. "You can't leave," the fearful voice insisted. "What about financial security? The house? Your reputation?" I capped the lipstick and straightened my shoulders. What about my dignity, my happiness, the career I'd abandoned? The children we'd never had because James always said the timing wasn't right. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Eliza?" It was Melissa. "People are starting to notice your absence. Are you sure you're okay?" I opened the door to find her concerned face. Melissa was one of the few genuine friendships I'd maintained despite James's subtle disapproval. A successful psychiatrist who'd never quite fit into James's curated social circle, she had remained stubbornly in my life. "I've been better," I admitted quietly. She glanced over her shoulder to ensure we were alone. "Listen, what James did out there was emotional abuse, plain and simple. You know that, right?" The word abuse hung in the air between us. I'd never applied that label to my marriage before. Difficult, yes. Challenging, certainly. But abuse? He's under a lot of pressure with the Westover case, I found myself saying, the justification automatic and hollow even to my own ears. Melissa's eyes narrowed. "Stop making excuses for him. I've watched this pattern for years and it's getting worse. The snide comments, the public criticism, the obvious affair." She took my hands in hers. The Eliza I knew in college would never have tolerated this treatment. The Eliza she knew in college. The memory of that woman, confident, ambitious, unwilling to settle, pierced through years of careful conditioning. "What would you do?" I whispered. "I'd remember who I was before him," she said simply. and I'd ask myself if this is the life I want for the next 30 years. The next 30 years. The thought landed like a stone in my stomach. 3 decades of dwindling self-worth, of public humiliation, of pretending not to notice the lipstick stains that weren't mine. I need to think, I said. Of course. Melissa squeezed my hand. But don't think too long. James is getting louder, and Christine is practically sitting in his lap. As Melissa left, I found myself alone with the question that had been building for months, maybe years. Stay or go? Staying meant security, social standing, the comfortable numbness of routine. It meant maintaining the facade we'd constructed, the successful power couple, the envy of our social circle. It meant accepting that midnight texts from Christine, the diminishing comments, the public mockery were the price of admission. Leaving meant uncertainty. Where would I go? How would I support myself? What would people say? The questions multiplied, a tidal wave of practical concerns threatening to drown the whisper of my self-respect. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to imagine both futures with brutal honesty. If I stayed, I could see myself growing smaller, quieter, less visible with each passing year. I could see the sidelong glances of pity from people like Melissa, the triumph in Christine's eyes, the escalating boldness of James's cruelty. If I left, the image was blurrier, frightening in its uncertainty, but somehow I could breathe there. I could stand straight. I could remember the woman who'd graduated with honors, who'd argued cases with passion, who'd never needed anyone's approval to know her worth. My phone buzzed again, an email notification. Mindlessly, I opened it and froze. It was from the hiring partner at Caldwell & Schmidt, responding to an application I'd sent 3 weeks ago during a moment of rare courage. We were impressed with your credentials and would like to schedule an interview at your earliest convenience. My breath caught. I'd applied on impulse after a particularly bad fight, convinced James would never find out. I'd almost forgotten about it in the chaos of planning tonight's dinner party. But here it was, an escape route, a lifeline, a sign. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Then doubt crashed in. Could I really practice law again after 5 years away? Would they see me as damaged goods once they learned about my personal life? Was I still the sharp legal mind I'd once been, or had I lost that woman forever? I remembered the last case I'd worked on before leaving the firm, a complex corporate merger that I'd handled brilliantly. My old boss had been furious when I resigned, had told me I was making the biggest mistake of my career. At the time, I'd been so certain that supporting James was the right choice, that love meant sacrifice. But what had he sacrificed for me? The answer rang in the empty bathroom. Nothing. He'd taken my support, my intelligence, my devotion, and offered mockery in return. I straightened my dress and looked in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back wasn't just sad or angry. She was resolute. Tonight wouldn't end with tearful recriminations or desperate pleas. It would end with clarity. I tucked my phone away and opened the bathroom door, the sounds of the party washing over me. James's voice carried above the others, telling some anecdote that had everyone laughing. I moved through the hallway like a ghost, observing the life I'd helped build, the artwork we'd collected on trips to Europe, the photographs of charity galas and vacation homes, the carefully curated evidence of a perfect life that felt increasingly hollow. In the living room doorway, I paused. James stood by the fireplace, one arm casually draped around Christine's waist as if he had every right. Her head was tilted toward him, her expression adoring. Around them, our guests sipped expensive wine and laughed at his jokes, either oblivious to or complicit in the humiliation of their hostess. For a moment, I saw the scene as an outsider might. The successful attorney, the younger woman, the discarded wife. It was such a cliché that in any other circumstance I might have laughed, but I wasn't laughing now. I was calculating. If I confronted him here, in front of everyone, he would turn it against me, paint me as hysterical, unreasonable, embarrassing. If I waited until everyone left, he would deny everything, gaslight me into believing I'd imagined the whole scene. The familiar dance exhausted me suddenly. I was tired of the choreography, tired of playing my assigned role. As I watched James refill Christine's glass, their fingers lingering against each other, something crystallized within me. This wasn't just about tonight. It wasn't even about Christine. It was about reclaiming the woman I'd been, the woman who would never have tolerated being someone's convenient prop, someone's punchline. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room, my decision made. Whatever happened next, I would face it not as James's diminished wife, but as Eliza Montgomery, attorney at law, a woman who had temporarily forgotten her worth, but who was ready to remember. The path ahead was uncertain, terrifying in its openness. But for the first time in years, I felt something like excitement flickering beneath the fear. I moved through the party with renewed purpose, a glass of water replacing the wine I'd abandoned in the kitchen. Alcohol would only cloud the clarity I'd finally achieved. I needed to be sharp, present, aware of every nuance in the room. James caught my eye as I entered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before he masked it with a broad smile. "There she is," he called out too loudly. "We were beginning to think you'd fallen in." More laughter, more humiliation. But this time something had changed. The barb didn't pierce as deeply. Instead, I observed his behavior with clinical detachment, like examining evidence in a case. "Just freshening up," I replied evenly, my voice carrying across the room. "One of us needs to remain presentable." A few eyebrows raised. This wasn't the script. The dutiful wife was supposed to laugh along, to accept the mockery as her due. James's smile faltered momentarily. "Another drink, babe?" he asked, an edge to his voice that only I would recognize. A warning. "I'm fine with water," I said, raising my glass slightly. "I find I'm thinking much more clearly tonight." Christine shifted uncomfortably beside him, perhaps sensing the subtle change in atmosphere. Her hand dropped from his arm, and she took a small step away, rats abandoning a ship they sensed might be sinking. The Westover case came up in conversation, James's current obsession, a high-profile, corporate fraud case that could make or break his shot at managing partner. He launched into an explanation of a particular legal strategy, stumbling slightly over the details. "Actually," I found myself saying, "the precedent in Harrington versus Midwest Financial established that corporate officers can't claim ignorance when documentation shows they received the fraudulent reports. The burden of proof shifts to the defendant." The room fell silent. James stared at me, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. "That's correct," he said finally. "I'm impressed you remembered that, honey." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, as if I hadn't graduated summa cum laude, as if I hadn't clerked for a federal judge, as if my legal mind hadn't once been the envy of our class. "I did graduate from the same law school as you, James," I said mildly, "and I was editor of the Law Review." Michael, James's law partner, chuckled appreciatively. "She's got you there, James. Eliza was the one we all wanted to partner with back in school. Brilliant analytical mind." I saw something dangerous flash in James's eyes, the same look he got when opposing counsel scored a point against him. He didn't like being contradicted, especially not in his own home, in front of his carefully cultivated audience. "Well," he said, swirling his scotch, "a lot has changed since law school. Some of us continued to build our careers while others chose different paths. The implication hung in the air, that I had chosen domesticity over achievement, comfort over challenge. That my current status as his wife rather than a practicing attorney was somehow evidence of lesser ambition, lesser intelligence. What James didn't know, what no one in this room except perhaps Melissa suspected, was that the choice had never been mine. It had been a slow, deliberate campaign. His complaints about my long hours, his concerns about how a two-lawyer household created unnecessary competition, his subtle undermining of my confidence until stepping back from my career seemed like the only way to save our marriage. Different paths, I agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. Though I've been reconsidering mine lately. A flicker of unease crossed his face. Oh? Yes. I've been thinking it might be time to return to practice. The words emerged with surprising ease, as if they'd been waiting just beneath the surface. As I spoke them, I felt something click into place. The final piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. Christine laughed nervously. But James always says the firm spouse should focus on networking and entertaining. That's a full-time job itself. Is that what James says? I replied, smiling placidly. How interesting. Judge Harriman, a longtime friend of James's father and a powerful figure in the legal community, studied me with newfound interest. The courts could always use sharp minds like yours, Eliza. The profession has changed since you stepped away. More flexible hours, remote work options. If you're serious about returning, I'd be happy to make some introductions. James stepped forward, placing his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that might have appeared affectionate to others, but felt possessive to me. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, he said smoothly. Eliza's just thinking out loud. We haven't discussed any of this. I felt the weight of his arm like a shackle. For years, I'd interpreted his protectiveness as love, his control as concern. Now I recognized it for what it was, ownership. Actually, I said, gently removing his arm, I've already sent out some applications. In fact, I heard back from Caldwell and Schmidt today. The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Harriman's eyebrows rose appreciatively, while Michael looked between James and me with dawning comprehension. Christine's smug expression had vanished entirely. James's face hardened, the mask of congenial host slipping to reveal something cold beneath. Well, he said tightly, this is certainly the first I'm hearing about it. Is it? I asked innocently. I must have mentioned it during one of your late nights at the office. With Christine. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. I had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. 8 years of maintaining appearances, of protecting James's image, of swallowing my pride, all of it shattered with a single sentence. Judge Harriman cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should call it a night. It's getting rather late. Others murmured agreement, suddenly fascinated by their watches, their phones, anything but the marital disaster unfolding before them. James's smile was brittle as he addressed the room. Nonsense. The night's still young. Eliza's just making a joke. Her sense of humor can be so unexpected. It wasn't a joke, I said, my voice quiet but firm. And I think everyone here knows it. The room grew uncomfortably warm as guests exchanged glances. The exodus began in earnest. Awkward goodbyes, hasty retrievals of coats and purses, mumbled excuses about babysitters and early meetings. Melissa was the last to leave, embracing me tightly. Whatever you need, she whispered. My guest room is yours. Any time, day or night. Then the door closed, and I was alone with James. The silence between us was charged, dangerous. I could practically see him calculating his approach, whether to deny, to attack, to manipulate. What the hell was that? He finally asked, his voice deceptively quiet. That, I replied, equally calm, was me telling the truth for the first time in years. He laughed incredulously. The truth? You humiliated me in front of my colleagues, my mentors. Do you have any idea what you've done? Interesting, I observed. How you think the humiliation flows only one way. Did you have any idea what you were doing when you mocked my dress? When you flaunted your affair in our home? When you systematically dismantled my self-worth for years? You're being dramatic, he scoffed, but uncertainty had crept into his eyes. This wasn't the script either. The tearful confrontation, the hysterical accusations he could easily dismiss. My calm precision seemed to unnerve him more than any emotional outburst could have. Am I? I moved to the bar cart and poured myself a small measure of scotch. His scotch, the expensive kind he never offered guests. Tell me, James, if I pulled your phone out right now, what would I find? How many messages from Christine? How many hotel receipts? How many lies? His expression darkened. You're going through my phone now? I don't need to, I replied. Your behavior tells me everything. But more importantly, I've realized something tonight. Whether you're sleeping with Christine or not doesn't actually matter. This seemed to bring him up short. What? What matters is that I don't like who I've become in this marriage. I don't like who you've become. I don't like that you find it acceptable to mock me in front of our friends. I don't like pretending not to notice when you come home with another woman's perfume on your collar. I took a deliberate sip of his scotch, savoring the burn. Most of all, I don't like that I've allowed it for so long. And with those words, I felt the last piece fall into place. The threshold had been crossed. Whatever happened next, whether I walked out tonight or fought through months of attempts to save what might be unsalvageable, I had reclaimed something essential. My voice, my boundaries, my self-respect. The reckoning had begun. James paced the living room, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. You've lost your mind, he said, his voice rising. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Those people are my colleagues, my mentors, my friends. Your friends, I repeated, the word tasting bitter. The same friends who laughed when you mocked me? The same friends who've pretended not to notice your affair with Christine? He stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. There is no affair. Christine is... Stop, I interrupted, raising my hand. Please don't insult my intelligence on top of everything else. I've seen the texts, James. I've smelled her perfume on your shirts. I've noticed the lipstick shade that isn't mine. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not blind. Something shifted in his expression, the realization that the usual tactics wouldn't work. The denial, the gaslighting, the making me question my own perceptions. All of it suddenly ineffective against this new version of me. Fine, he said coldly. You want honesty? Yes, Christine and I have been sleeping together. For months. Are you happy now? The confession should have devastated me. Instead, I felt a strange sense of vindication. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. Why not just end our marriage if you wanted someone else? He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. End our marriage? Do you have any idea what that would cost me? Half my assets, half my retirement, not to mention my reputation. The firm doesn't look kindly on divorce, especially when a partner is trading in his wife for a younger model. So instead, you decided to have both? To keep me for appearances while satisfying your needs elsewhere? James shrugged, the gesture so callous it took my breath away. It was working fine until tonight. You had a comfortable life, Eliza. The house, the cars, the social standing, all of it provided by me. All you had to do was play your part. My part, I repeated softly. The supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who accepts public humiliation and private betrayal without complaint. Don't be so dramatic. Every marriage has compromises. I studied him. This man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, whose success I'd championed, whose dreams I'd helped build. I searched for some glimpse of the person I'd fallen in love with, but there was nothing recognizable in his cold assessment of our relationship. I want a divorce, I said, the words emerging clear and determined. James froze, his confident demeanor faltering. What? You heard me. I want a divorce. I'll be contacting an attorney tomorrow. Don't be ridiculous, he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. You can't just decide something like this in the heat of the moment. We need to talk about this when we're both calmer. I've never been calmer, I replied. And it was true. The panic, the fear, the desperate need to save our marriage, all of it had been replaced by a steady resolve. In fact, I've never seen things more clearly. He switched tactics, his expression softening. Liz, honey, I know I messed up. The thing with Christine, it's nothing. Just a fling. It doesn't mean anything. And that's supposed to make me feel better? That you betrayed our marriage for something meaningless? I'm saying I can end it. Tonight. We can work through this. Couples counseling, a vacation, whatever you need. But throwing away 8 years of marriage over one mistake is insane. One mistake? I echoed. James, the affair is just a symptom. The disease is what our marriage has become, what you've turned it into. A place where I'm diminished, mocked, controlled, where my dreams don't matter, where my feelings are inconvenient, where my presence is valuable only as long as it serves. Your image. He raked his hands through his hair again, frustration mounting. So this is about your career? Fine. Go back to work. I'll support you. Hell, I'll make some calls tomorrow, get you interviews at friendly firms. It's not about the career, though. That's part of it. It's about respect. It's about partnership. It's about looking at yourself in the mirror and recognizing the person looking back. I moved toward the staircase, suddenly exhausted. I'm going to pack a bag. I'll stay with Melissa tonight, then find a place of my own tomorrow. Panic flashed across James's face. He stepped forward, blocking my path to the stairs. You're not going anywhere. Not tonight. Not like this. Move, James. No. We're going to sit down like adults and figure this out. You can't just walk out on our marriage. Watch me, I said, attempting to step around him. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. I said, You're not leaving. I looked, pointedly at his hand, then back at his face. Let go of me, now. Something in my tone must have registered, because he released me immediately, taking a step back. Eliza, please. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have grabbed you like that. I'm in shock here. You've blindsided me. The way you blindsided me when you started sleeping with Christine? Or when you mocked me in front of everyone we know, he had the grace to look ashamed, at least momentarily. I know I've been an ass. The comment about your dress, it was stupid and cruel. I had too much to drink, and I was showing off. But that's not who I really am. Isn't it? I asked quietly. Because it seems to me that's exactly who you are. Who you've become. The man who proposed to me 8 years ago would never have treated anyone the way you treated me tonight. James's expression shifted, a calculating look replacing the contrition. Think about what you're giving up, Eliza. This house. Our lifestyle. If you file for divorce, it gets ugly. I'll fight you on every asset, every penny. My firm against whatever discount lawyer you can afford on your own. The threat was clear, but instead of intimidating me, it only reinforced my decision. There it is, the real James Kingston, always ready to use his power, his connections, his money to control others, to control me. I took a step toward him, my voice steady. But here's what you don't understand. I'm not afraid of you anymore. I'm not afraid of losing this house, this lifestyle, any of it. What terrifies me is spending another day living this lie, another day shrinking myself to accommodate your ego. You'll regret this, he warned. When you're struggling to pay rent, when you're starting over at entry level because you've been out of practice for years when you're alone, you'll remember what you threw away. Maybe, I conceded. But I'd rather face those struggles than spend another minute feeling the way I've felt in this marriage, diminished, invisible, worthless. I moved past him, heading for the stairs. This time he didn't try to stop me. "I'll give you tonight," I said, pausing on the first step, "to think about how you want this to proceed. We can make it amicable, fair, or we can make it the war you're threatening. Either way, I'm done." "Eliza," he called after me, his voice suddenly desperate. "Please, I love you. I know I don't always show it the right way, but I do. We can fix this." I turned back, studying his face. The perfect jawline I'd once traced with my fingers. The blue eyes that used to look at me with admiration rather than contempt. "That's the problem, James. I don't think it can be fixed. And I'm not sure I want to try anymore." As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I felt lighter with each step. The woman who had entered this house hours ago, anxious about hosting the perfect dinner party, desperate for her husband's approval, terrified of public humiliation. She was fading with every moment, replaced by someone stronger. Someone I recognized from long ago. I pulled a suitcase from the closet and began methodically packing what I would need for the next few days. The rest could wait. Tonight was about taking the first step, about declaring my intent not just to James, but to myself. I was leaving. I was reclaiming my life. And no amount of threats, promises, or manipulations would change my mind. The declaration had been made. There was no turning back. I zipped the suitcase closed, surveying our bedroom one last time. The space that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like an elaborate stage set. The perfect bedding, the coordinated furniture, all chosen to create an impression rather than provide comfort. From downstairs came the sound of breaking glass. I froze, listening as James cursed loudly. Then silence. I returned to my packing, adding a few more essentials to my overnight bag. The bedroom door burst open. James stood in the doorway, his perfect composure completely shattered. His tie hung loose around his neck, hair disheveled, eyes wild. "You can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "You can't just leave." I continued packing, adding my laptop and charger to the bag. "I think we've said everything there is to say." "No, we haven't. You haven't let me explain." He moved further into the room, and I noticed his hand was bleeding slightly. "The decanter," he said, following my gaze. I knocked it over. "It doesn't matter." He sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly looking defeated. "Eliza, please, just stop and listen to me." Something in his voice, a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years, made me pause. I set down the toiletry bag I'd been filling and turned to face him. "I'm listening." James stared at his hands, blood from the cut mixing with what looked like tears. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words seeming to physically pain him. "I'm terrified of losing you." "You should have thought about that before, Christine, before tonight." "I know. God, I know." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I've been a monster. The things I said tonight, the way I've treated you, I don't even recognize myself anymore. I'd expected anger, manipulation, perhaps even threats. Not this broken man before me." For a moment, doubt flickered. Was this genuine remorse or another performance? "It's too late, James." "No," he said suddenly, sliding from the bed to his knees. "It's not too late, it can't be." The sight was jarring. James Kingston, who prided himself on control and dignity, kneeling on our bedroom floor, tears streaming down his face. "I'll do anything," he pleaded. "Counseling, therapy, I'll quit the firm, move to another city, whatever." "You want. Just don't leave. Not like this." I stepped back, unsettled by his desperation. "Get up, James. This isn't helping." "I can't lose you," he continued, as if he hadn't heard me. "You're everything to me. I know I haven't shown it. I know I've been cruel and selfish and blind, but you're the only good thing in my life. Stop it." My voice hardened. "This isn't about your feelings right now. It's about years of disrespect, of public humiliation, of betrayal. He reached for my hand, and I allowed the contact, if only to stop him from grasping at my clothes. I'll make it right. I swear to God, I'll spend every day making it up to you. And Christine? Over. Completely over. I'll never speak to her again. I withdrew my hand gently. 5 minutes ago, you were threatening to destroy me in a divorce. Now you're on your knees begging me to stay. Which is the real James? He hung his head. Both. Neither. I don't know anymore. When you said you were leaving, I panicked. I lashed out. It's what I do when I'm scared. That's not an excuse. No, it's not. He looked up at me, eyes pleading. But it's the truth. I'm terrified, Eliza. Not just of losing you, but of facing what I've become, what I've done to us. For a brief moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable, honest, capable of self-reflection. Then I remembered the cruel smirk as he'd mocked my dress, the intimate glances with Christine, the years of subtle undermining. "Get up, James," I said firmly. "This display isn't going to change my mind." He remained kneeling, reaching for my suitcase. "Please," he begged, voice cracking. "Just one more chance. I'll go to therapy. I'll get help for my drinking. I'll do whatever it takes." I gently moved the suitcase out of his reach. "I need to go." "Where? To Melissa's? To your mother's?" "Wherever you're going, I'll wait. I'll send flowers every day. I'll write letters. I'll prove to you that I can change." The desperation in his voice was unsettling. This wasn't the calculating attorney who'd threatened me minutes earlier. This was a drowning man clutching at anything that might save him. "James," I said quietly, "this isn't healthy, for either of us." He finally stood, wiping his face with his sleeve, a gesture so uncharacteristic of the polished man I knew that it gave me pause. "Tell me what to do," he whispered. "Tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a complicated mix of emotions: pity, residual affection, sadness for what might have been. But the clarity I'd found earlier remained. "I need time and space," I said finally. "Not promises, not grand gestures, just distance. To think clearly." Hope flickered in his eyes. "Time. I can give you time. How long? A week? A month?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But tonight, I'm leaving. And you need to let me go." For a moment, I thought he might block the door again, might revert to threats and control. Instead, his shoulders slumped in. Defeat. "Can I call you?" he asked, his voice small. "Not for a while. I'll contact you when I'm ready." He nodded slowly, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I love you, Eliza. I know I haven't shown it, but I do." I picked up my suitcase and bag, moving toward the door. "Goodbye, James." His desperate whisper followed me down the stairs. "Please don't go." The night air felt crisp against my face as I stepped outside, suitcase in hand. Our Tudor Revival home loomed behind me, windows glowing warmly in the darkness. From the outside, it looked perfect, the embodiment of success and domestic bliss. How many times had I stood in the driveway, admiring this facade, convincing myself that the appearance of happiness was enough? My hands trembled slightly as I loaded my luggage into the trunk of my car. 8 years of marriage ended in a single evening. Or perhaps it had been ending for years, tonight merely the culmination of 1,000 small betrayals. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. James stood in the doorway, watching me, his silhouette framed by the light behind him. For a moment, I thought he might come after me, might make one last desperate attempt to stop me from leaving. Instead, he remained frozen, a statue of the man I'd once loved. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, watching the house, our house, grow smaller in my rearview mirror until it disappeared from sight entirely. Only then did I release the breath I'd been holding. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, just a few cars making their way through the manicured neighborhoods of our suburban enclave. I drove on autopilot, muscle memory guiding me toward Melissa's house across town. My mind, however, was racing through the events of the evening, trying to process the seismic shift that had occurred. Had I overreacted? Was I throwing away a marriage that could be saved? James's tears and pleas had seemed genuine, his remorse palpable. Then I remembered the cruel laughter, the intimate glances with Christine, the years of diminishment. No, I hadn't overreacted. If anything, I had underreacted for far too long. Pulled into Melissa's driveway 40 minutes later, having circled several blocks to clear my head. The porch light came on before I'd even turned off the engine, and Melissa appeared in the doorway, still dressed in her dinner party attire but with her heels replaced by slippers. "I've been worried sick," she said, hurrying down the steps. "Are you okay? Did he try to stop you?" "He tried," I admitted, accepting her embrace. "But I left anyway." She helped me with my bags, leading me into her warm, cluttered home, so different from the pristine showcase I'd left behind. "Guest room's all made up. I put out fresh towels in the bathroom and there's a spare toothbrush in the drawer." "Thank you," I said, the weight of her kindness nearly undoing me. "I know it's late. I hope I didn't wake Sarah." "She's at her dad's this weekend." Melissa guided me to her kitchen, where she poured 2 glasses of wine. "So, talk to me. What happened after everyone left?" I sank into a chair at her breakfast nook, suddenly exhausted. "He denied everything, at first. Then admitted to the affair when I confronted him. Then threatened me with financial ruin if I tried to leave. Then fell to his knees begging me to stay. All within about 20 minutes. Melissa whistled low. "Sounds like James hit every branch on the way down the manipulation tree." "Pretty much. And how are you feeling about all of it?" I considered the question carefully. "Relieved," I said, finally. "Terrified, but mostly free." She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "I'm proud of you, Eliza. What you did tonight took incredible courage." "Did it?" I stared into my wine glass, watching the liquid catch the light. "It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like self-preservation. Sometimes they're the same thing." My phone buzzed. The 7th text from James in the past hour. I turned it face down without reading the message. "He won't stop," Melissa observed. "No," I agreed. "Not yet, but he will, eventually." "What's your next move?" I took a sip of wine, the question bringing me back to practicalities. "I need to find an apartment, contact a divorce attorney, figure out my finances." "And the job interview?" "Tuesday at Caldwell and Schmidt, though I'm also considering Judge Harriman's clerk position offer." Melissa raised her eyebrows. "He offered you a clerkship? Tonight?" "On his way out. Slipped me his card." I smiled faintly. Apparently not everyone thinks my legal skills have evaporated during my time as Mrs. James Kingston. "Of course they haven't. You were the brightest legal mind in our class." My phone buzzed again, then immediately began ringing. James's face appeared on the screen. A candid shot from our anniversary. Trip to Maui last year, his smile carefree and genuine. I silenced the call. "You should probably block him," Melissa suggested gently. "At least for tonight." "You're right." I navigated to my contacts and hovered my finger over the block option, hesitating briefly before tapping it. The action felt monumental, a digital severing of ties that paralleled the physical distance I'd put between us. "There," I said, setting the phone down. "First step." "To many more," Melissa said, raising her glass. We clinked glasses softly, the quiet chime echoing in the peaceful kitchen. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering gently against the windows. The sound was soothing, cleansing. "You can stay here as long as you need," Melissa offered. No rush to figure everything out tonight. I nodded gratefully, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. For the first time in years, I didn't have to maintain a perfect facade. I didn't have to anticipate James's moods or minimize my own needs. I could simply be. I should get some sleep, I said, rising from the table. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. The first of many, Melissa replied, her expression thoughtful. You know, I always wondered when you'd remember who you really are. And who is that? I asked. The Eliza Montgomery who never backed down from a challenge. The woman who argued Thompson versus Westbrook in front of the state Supreme Court as a third-year associate and won. The friend who taught me to stand up for myself when that senior partner kept taking credit for my work. Her words settled over me like a warm blanket, reminding me of strengths I'd nearly forgotten I possessed. I'm rediscovering her, I said quietly, day by day. As I lay in Melissa's guest room later, listening to the rain, I realized that walking out of James's house hadn't just been an ending, it had been a beginning. The first concrete step toward reclaiming the woman I used to be and discovering who I might become. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges I could barely imagine. But for the first time in years, I was facing the future on my own terms, and that made all the difference. Morning arrived with harsh clarity. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains, momentarily disorienting me before I remembered where I was, Melissa's guest room, miles away from the life I'd left behind. My phone showed 17 missed calls from James and a barrage of texts ranging from apologetic to accusatory. Despite blocking his number, he'd switched to calling from his office line and sending emails marked urgent. I deleted them all without reading. Melissa had already left for her early hospital rounds, leaving coffee brewing and a note with the spare key. The quiet of her home felt strange after years of orchestrated morning routines with James. His preference for CNN playing in the background, his insistence on fresh squeezed orange juice, his complaints if I disturbed his review of the morning briefs. I poured myself coffee, savoring the simple pleasure of choosing when and how to start my day. Then reality crashed in. I needed clothes, toiletries, my important documents. Most of my life remained in James's house. My first call was to Vivian Chen, a divorce attorney whose reputation for handling high-conflict cases preceded her. Her assistant squeezed me in for a noon appointment after I mentioned James's firm. We'll need to act quickly, Vivian said hours later, her office overlooking the city skyline. Men like your husband don't respond well to losing control. He'll try to hide assets, claim career sacrifices, possibly even attempt to paint you as unstable. I nodded, the legal strategy simultaneously familiar and surreal. He's already threatened to use his firm against me. Vivian smiled thinly. Fortunately, threatening your spouse during divorce proceedings doesn't play well before most judges. We'll document everything. I left with a detailed to-do list. Secure personal documents, open separate bank accounts, inventory household assets, and prepare for financial disclosure. The logistics were daunting, but having concrete tasks helped anchor me. Next came apartment hunting, a process I hadn't navigated in nearly a decade. The rental market had exploded, and prices had doubled since I'd last looked. Reality hit hard. On my non-existent income, I couldn't afford anything close to the lifestyle James had provided. I found a small one-bedroom in a modest building across town, clean but basic, with none of the luxury amenities I'd grown accustomed to. The leasing agent raised her eyebrows when I couldn't provide proof of current employment. My interview with Caldwell and Schmidt is tomorrow, I explained, and I have savings to cover 6 months' rent. We typically require employment verification, she began. I understand. Would a cosigner help? Dr. Melissa Foster has offered. The words tasted bitter, having to rely on a friend's creditworthiness at 42 years old. Another consequence of surrendering my career for James's comfort. With the apartment application submitted, I faced my next challenge, returning to James's house to collect my essentials. Melissa had offered to accompany me, but this was something I needed to do alone. I timed my visit for when James would typically be in court, 2 p.m. on a Monday. As I turned onto our street, my heart sank. His car sat in the driveway, alongside another I recognized as belonging to his mother, Eleanor. For a moment, I considered leaving, returning another day. Then anger surged. This was still legally my home, with my possessions inside. I wouldn't be intimidated. Eleanor opened the door before I could use my key. Her usually impeccable appearance had faltered. Her eyes were rimmed red, her silver hair less perfectly coiffed. "Eliza," she said, voice wavering between coolness and distress. "James said you might come by." "I need to collect some things," I replied, stepping past her into the foyer. "He's devastated," she continued, following me. "I've never seen him like this. Not eating, not sleeping. You've broken something in him." I paused at the stairs. "I didn't break anything, Eleanor. James did that himself. Marriages have rough patches. Kingston women don't abandon their husbands over one bad night. It wasn't one night." I turned to face her fully. "And I'm not a Kingston woman. I'm Eliza Montgomery." James appeared at the top of the stairs, unshaven and hollow-eyed. "Mom, please," he said quietly. "Give us a minute." Eleanor hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave. "Remember what we discussed," she murmured to him before retreating to the kitchen. James descended slowly, looking like a man who'd aged years overnight. "You came back," he said, hope coloring his voice. "For my things," I clarified. "Nothing else." His face fell. "Eliza, please. I haven't slept. I can't think straight. You can't throw away 8 years over one mistake." "It wasn't one mistake, James. It was a pattern. Years of diminishment, manipulation, and now infidelity. I'll change. I've already called Dr. Barrett about counseling. I told Christine she's being transferred to the Denver office. I have an appointment with Vivian Chen," I said, watching realization dawn on his face. "Vivian Chen?" His expression hardened. "You're already talking to divorce attorneys? It hasn't even been 24 hours. And you've already called your mother to intervene," I countered. "We're both taking steps to protect ourselves." He raked his hands through his disheveled hair. "This is insane. We should be talking, not lawyering up. Not bringing our families into it." "I'm going upstairs to pack some clothes and personal items," I said, sidestepping him. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." As I moved past, he caught my wrist, not roughly, but with enough pressure to stop me. "The firm is already asking questions. People are talking, Eliza. If we could just present a united front for a few weeks." I gently but firmly removed his hand. "Your reputation is no longer my responsibility." The look of betrayal on his face might once have weakened my resolve. Now it only confirmed I was making the right choice. Upstairs, I quickly gathered clothes, jewelry, important papers, and irreplaceable photographs. From the master bathroom, I heard Eleanor's voice rise and fall as she apparently counseled James on strategy. Their voices dropped to whispers when I re-emerged with my bags. "That's it?" James asked, eyeing my modest haul. "Where are you staying?" "With a friend," I replied vaguely. "You mean Melissa?" His tone sharpened. "She's always had it out for me. She's been a good friend, which is more than I can say for most of our social circle." As I headed for the door, James made one last attempt. "The Andersons' anniversary party is Saturday. People will notice if we're not there together." I turned back, genuinely surprised. "After everything that's happened, you're worried about a party?" "I'm worried about us," he insisted, "about our life together." "Goodbye, James," I said, closing the door firmly behind me. In my car, I finally exhaled. The first challenges had been met, lawyer consulted, Apartment hunting begun, essential possessions secured. None of it had been easy, but each step reinforced my decision. Independence came with complexity and uncertainty, but also with something I'd almost forgotten: self-respect. 6 months had passed since that fateful dinner party. 6 months of rebuilding, of facing challenges I never anticipated, of discovering strengths I'd forgotten I possessed. The interview at Caldwell and Schmidt had gone exceptionally well, but in the end, I'd accepted Judge Harriman's clerkship offer. The regular hours and reduced stress had given me space to heal while rediscovering my passion for the law. The judge had become a mentor, pushing me to consider my next steps carefully, rather than rushing into another high-pressure position. My modest apartment had gradually become home. Without James's exacting standards, I decorated it to suit my own tastes. Comfortable furniture, walls painted in soothing blues rather than the stark whites he'd preferred. Bookshelves filled with novels I'd once hidden away because he found fiction frivolous. The divorce proceedings had been contentious as Vivian predicted. James had alternated between desperate reconciliation attempts and vindictive legal maneuvers. He'd frozen accounts, claimed I was emotionally unstable, even sent Christine to my workplace with a fabricated legal document, a stunt that earned him a stern rebuke from the judge. Through it all, I'd remained steady, refusing to engage in the drama. Each petty action only confirmed I'd made the right decision. Today marked a significant milestone. Our divorce was final. After a grueling deposition where James had finally acknowledged his affair and financial manipulations, he'd agreed to a settlement. It wasn't everything Vivian had pushed for, but it provided financial security while I rebuilt my career. I sat at an outdoor cafe, enjoying the spring sunshine and the sense of closure. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Freedom papers signed? Celebration dinner tonight." I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. My circle had changed dramatically. Gone were the superficial relationships built around James's career, replaced by genuine friendships with people who valued me for myself. "Eliza," I looked up to find Patricia Wilson, wife of James's senior partner, standing by my table. We hadn't spoken since the dinner party. "May I join you?" she asked hesitantly. I gestured to the empty chair, curious rather than anxious about this unexpected encounter. "You look well," she said, settling across from me. "Happier." "I am," I replied simply. Patricia fidgeted with her designer handbag. "I've wanted to call you, but I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from anyone connected to that world." "It would have been nice to hear from a friend," I said honestly. She winced. "I wasn't much of a friend that night, was I?" "None of us were." "No," I agreed. "You weren't." I've thought about it so many times. How we all sat there while James humiliated you. How we pretended not to notice what was happening with Christine. She shook her head. The firm politics, the social hierarchy. It seemed so important then. And now? Now? Patricia laughed softly. "Let's just say your courage sparked some overdue conversations in my marriage. Thomas and I are in counseling. I've gone back to teaching part-time. I raised my eyebrows, genuinely surprised. Patricia had been the quintessential corporate wife, her identity completely subsumed by her husband's career. "Good for you," I said, meaning it. She hesitated before adding, "James isn't doing well. The partners are concerned about his judgment. There's talk of asking him to take a leave of absence." I absorbed this information without the satisfaction I might once have expected. "That's unfortunate, but it's not my concern anymore." "No, of course not," Patricia agreed quickly. "I just thought you should know what you did that night, standing up for yourself. It changed things, not just for you." After Patricia left, I remained at the cafe, contemplating how differently I viewed the world now. 6 months ago, news of James's professional troubles would have filled me with anxiety. his mood swings, the pressure I'd feel to help manage. The situation, the inevitable blame that would fall on me. Now, I felt only a distant compassion for the man I'd once loved, mixed with gratitude for the painful awakening that had set me free. My phone rang, Judge Harriman calling with news about a prestigious judicial appointment opening up. They're looking for candidates with diverse experience, he explained. Your name came up in preliminary discussions. After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence. A year ago, such an opportunity would have seemed impossible. My confidence, too, shattered, my skills too rusty, my identity too tied to being James Kingston's wife. As I walked home through the park, I passed a young couple arguing on a bench, the woman tearfully apologizing while the man berated her clothing choices. For a moment, I saw myself reflected in her downcast eyes, her hunched shoulders. I slowed my pace, considering whether to intervene. Before I could decide, the woman stood up, gathered her purse, and walked away despite the man's protests. I smiled to myself, silently cheering her first step. My apartment building came into view, nothing like the showcase home I'd shared with James, but entirely mine. Inside, I'd hung just one memento from my previous life, a photograph from law, school graduation before I'd met James. In it, I stood proud and determined, eyes bright with ambition and self-belief. That woman hadn't disappeared after all. She'd been waiting patiently to emerge again, stronger for having survived the darkness, as I unlocked my door. I realized the journey hadn't been about escaping James or his cruelty. It had been about reclaiming myself, the woman who would never again accept mockery as affection, control as protection, or diminishment as love. The night of that dinner party, when James had mocked me in front of his lover and friends, he'd unknowingly gifted me the most important realization of my life. I deserved better, not just from him, but from myself. And in that knowledge, I had found my freedom.